This happened many years ago, but I thought I would share considering it has been on my mind lately, and it's a good one. For context, my name is Elise, and I'm a 55-year-old woman, but was 38 at the time of this story. Also, it's important to note that I'm an OBGYN. My best friend and favorite nurse, Carla, walked up to me one day and said, "You need a break from this place, Elise," she said, nudging my arm. "You've been married to your job long enough. It's time for a real relationship." I remember I sighed, barely looking up from my clipboard. "I don't have time for a relationship, Carla. You know that. Between delivering babies and paperwork, my social life is non-existent." "Exactly. That's why I've taken matters into my own hands," Carla said. "I set you up on a date for tomorrow night. His name is Jake. He's a teacher, charming, and most importantly, single." I froze, staring at Carla. "You did what?" "Trust me, you'll thank me later," Carla said, already walking away to check on a patient before I could even get a word or response out. The following evening, I found myself in a chic Italian restaurant, feeling uncharacteristically nervous. I'd chosen a simple black dress, hoping it struck the right balance between professional and approachable. I hadn't been on a date since my divorce 5 years earlier. It was a messy one, and I swore off relationships altogether. I mean, if my ex-husband and I couldn't make our 10-year-long marriage last, then I wasn't going to try for a second one. Jake arrived a few minutes later, a tall man with a confident stride and warm brown eyes. "You must be Elise," he said, extending his hand. "Carla's told me great things about you." I smiled, shaking his hands. "She's been singing your praises too. It's nice to meet you." The evening started pleasantly enough. Jake was funny, well-read, and passionate about his job teaching high school history. I found myself relaxing, even laughing at his stories about students' antics. But as the dinner progressed, subtle cracks began to form in Jake's charming demeanor. Red flags started to come up. "So, you're an OBGYN?" he said, swirling his glass of wine. "That must be messy work." I chuckled, being used to such comments. "It can be, but it's incredibly rewarding. Helping bring new life into the world is unlike anything else." Jake nodded, but his smile faltered. "I don't know how you do it. All that blood and screaming, I couldn't handle something so primal." I felt a flicker of irritation. "Well, it's part of the process. Birth is a natural, beautiful thing." "Sure," Jake said, his tone flippant. "But don't you ever feel, I don't know, overwhelmed? All those women whining and making a fuss over something that's been happening for centuries?" My fork paused midair. I set it down carefully. "I wouldn't call it whining. Labor is an intense experience, and every patient deserves compassion and support." Jake shrugged, clearly oblivious to my growing discomfort. "I'm just saying. People today are so soft. My grandmother had 8 kids and never made a big deal about it." I forced a tight smile, trying to steer the conversation elsewhere. "So, what inspired you to become a teacher?" For a while, the conversation smoothed out, but the damage was done. I couldn't stand people like him. Obviously, no second date would be on the horizon. As we moved to dessert, Jake's dismissive attitude resurfaced, though. "You probably don't have much time for hobbies," he said, eyeing me across the table. "But if you did, what would they be? Knitting? Scrapbooking?" I blinked with annoyance. "I actually enjoy hiking and photography when I can find the time." Jake laughed, a little too loudly. "Photography? Let me guess. Sunsets and flowers?" My patience snapped. "Actually, no. I prefer landscapes and urban scenes, and just so we're clear, I'm not some stereotypical workaholic who can't have a life. I'm passionate about my career because it saves lives." Jake's smile faded, but he recovered quickly. "Whoa, calm down. I didn't mean to offend you." "Maybe you should think before speaking next time," I said, my voice steady but icy. The rest of the evening was excruciatingly awkward. When the check arrived, I didn't wait for Jake to offer to split it. I slapped down my credit card, determined to end the night on my own terms. As I left the restaurant, I pulled out my cell phone and called Carla. I just had to ask what the hell was with her setting me up with some clown who thinks that way about women. I could just tell he was a misogynist. "How'd it go?" Carla asked, her voice hopeful. "Let's just say you owe me a bottle of wine and an apology. Oh yeah, and an explanation on where you met that guy," I replied, heading for my car. Back home, I kicked off my heels and collapsed on the couch. The date had been a disaster, but it had reminded me of one important truth. I didn't need a man to complete me. My life was full, and my work gave me purpose, and let's just say, is my family. The next day, I met Carla for drinks and we talked about Jake. She had met him through another friend of hers that didn't know him that well, so I forgave her quickly. I had turned my phone off, and when I got home that night, realized I had a lot of missed calls and texts from Jake. I texted him and told him clearly about himself without sugarcoating it that he needed therapy and dating advice because he was a terrible date. He texted me back with something that really scared me. "Bitch, I will ruin you. Just wait." I blocked his number immediately. Back then, you had to go to the phone store and block the number. That night, after blocking the number, I got a knock on my door. It was him. Of course, it was 11 o'clock at night, so I didn't answer. Most of my lights were off anyway. "Open the door. I know you're awake. Just let me in. I want to talk," he said, and then ended with laughter. He knocked and banged on my door for about 20 minutes, then left. I debated on whether to call the cops or not, but I know how they are in these situations. He never did come back. I worried and couldn't sleep for a long time after that, though. My name is Anna, and this story takes place in 2009. When I was in the most worst part of my life, and by early 2013, everything seemed to look up, but then went down again quickly. Now since 2015, it has been wonderful. As I wrote this story you are about to read, I can't believe how far I have come. Enjoy. I had spent years trapped in a marriage defined by fear and control. My ex-husband now, Tom, had once been charming and loving, but over time, his demeanor darkened. The once adoring man became cruel, with sharp words and a temper that left me and our 8-year-old son Ethan walking on eggshells. The physical violence came later, always followed by promises of change that never came. After enduring this for far too long, I summoned the courage to leave. With Ethan in tow, I fled one rainy night, my heart pounding as I clutched his small hand. We found refuge in a shelter for domestic violence survivors. That's where I began piecing together the parts of my shattered life. Determined to provide a better future for my son, I filed for divorce and sought sole custody of Ethan, but Tom wasn't about to let me go that easily. The custody battle was grueling. Despite Tom's history of abuse, his expensive lawyer painted him as a devoted father. They minimized my experiences, claiming I was exaggerating out of spite. Tom's claims worked on the judge, and to my horror, the court awarded him joint custody. On some weekends, Ethan had to visit his father, and each time my stomach churned with dread. My worst fears were realized when Ethan returned home one Sunday with a bruise on his arm. When I asked what happened, Ethan hesitated, then mumbled, "Daddy got mad." Though my heart broke, I reported the incident. But without solid evidence, the authorities dismissed my claim, of course. Frustrated and scared, I hired lawyer after lawyer, draining my savings and working 2 jobs as I fought to protect my son. A year passed in this painful limbo. My persistence wore thin, but I refused to give up. Then one fateful weekend, the unimaginable happened. Tom's temper exploded in a fit of rage, and Ethan came back with a black eye and trembling hands. This time, there was no room for denial. Ethan's school counselor reported the injury to Child Protective Services, and a social worker launched an investigation. Armed with new evidence, I returned to court. This time, the judge listened. Tom's history of violence was undeniable, and the bruise on Ethan was proof of the danger he posed. I was granted full custody, and a restraining order was issued against Tom. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. Determined to start fresh, I moved to a new town with Ethan. I found a cozy house, enrolled Ethan in a local school, and began working as a graphic designer. Life slowly returned to normal, and the shadows of our past seemed to fade. I even met someone new, James, a kind and patient man who adored both me and Ethan. We were married in a small ceremony in 2013, surrounded by friends, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream of a bright future. But Tom wasn't done. Despite the restraining order, Tom found us. At first, it was subtle. A car parked down the street, a shadow in the distance. Then the harassment escalated. Late-night phone calls, cryptic notes left on our doorstep. Ethan began having nightmares, and my anxiety skyrocketed. James, ever supportive, encouraged me to document everything and involve the police. After months of building a case, Tom's behavior culminated in a terrifying confrontation. He showed up at Ethan's school demanding to see him. The school staff intervened and called the police, leading to Tom's arrest for violating the restraining order and stalking. In court, the evidence against Tom was overwhelming. Witness testified to his harassment, and my meticulous records painting a damning picture. Tom was sentenced to prison, and I finally felt a weight lift off my shoulders. With Tom behind bars, mine and Ethan's lives blossomed. Ethan thrived in school, free from fear, and James officially adopted him. I poured my energy into my career and my family, finding joy in the little moments. Ethan's laughter, James' unwavering support, and the peace that came from knowing we were safe. In 2015, after everything was good again, I found out I was pregnant at 42. I didn't care. Overjoyed, James and I could not wait for our daughter Alicia to be born. It was a hard pregnancy, and I was put on bed rest at just 5 months. And Alicia was born early, but she is now a 9-year-old beautiful girl who, like Ethan, is my heart. Ethan turned 18 in 2019 and graduated with honors. I was and am so proud of him. When Ethan came out as gay that same year, I couldn't be happier for him being himself. He is now out of college and already a career man. I couldn't be any prouder. He got married to Andrew this past summer, and they are planning on adopting a baby in the next coming years. Though the scars of the past lingered, I knew they didn't define me. I had fought for my son, for myself, and for the life we deserved. And as I watched my life continue to bloom, I don't regret anything that has happened since Tom. I knew one thing for certain: our story, though marked by struggle, is one of triumph and love. We have risen from the shadows, and the future was ours to embrace. I'd like to dedicate this story to James, Alicia, and Ethan. This happened in 2018. My husband and I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. Life had been busy, with work deadlines piling up and our social calendar overflowing. A camping trip was exactly what we needed and wanted to reconnect and unwind. We are huge outdoors people, or were. I had picked a spot deep in the forest, far from the bustling crowds of popular campgrounds. It was a secluded paradise I had read about online, and Jake, my husband, was excited for the adventure. As we drove through the winding roads that led to the campsite, we were enveloped by towering pines and peaceful silence. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue across the landscape. We finally reached the clearing that marked our spot, a perfect nook by a small lake. "This is amazing," I said, breathing in the crisp air. Jake grinned. You've outdone yourself. Let's get the tent up before it gets dark. We worked together, laughing as we fumbled with the tent poles, and soon our temporary home was ready. After a simple dinner of sandwiches and campfire s'mores, we sat by the fire watching the stars emerge. It was then we heard voices approaching. Hey there, a friendly voice called out. Jake and I turned to see a couple walking towards us. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. The woman, petite with short blonde hair, had an easy smile. Sorry to bother you, the man said, but we saw your fire and thought we'd say hi. We're camping a little ways down the trail. I'm Greg, he added, extending a hand, and this is my wife Laura. Jake shook his hand. I'm Jake, and this is Emily. Nice to meet you. Greg and Laura seemed charming, and the four of us chatted for a while. We swapped stories about camping and our favorite hiking trails. Before long, Greg and Laura said their goodbyes, heading back to their campsite. That was nice, I said as we settled into our tent. It's good to know there's someone else around. Jake nodded. Yeah, they seem cool. The next morning, we woke up to the sun streaming through the tent. After breakfast, we decided to hike one of the nearby trails. As we walked, we noticed odd things, though. Snapped branches, footprints that seemed to follow. Jake brushed it off as nothing, but I felt a creepy unease. When we returned to our campsite in the late afternoon, something was off. Our cooler had been moved, and one of our chairs was missing. Did we leave it somewhere? I asked. No, I'm sure we left it here, Jake said, frowning. We decided not to dwell on it. Perhaps an animal had dragged it off or something. That evening, as we sat by the fire, we heard faint laughter in the distance. It was eerie, echoing through the trees. Probably Greg and Laura, Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. Next day, things escalated. My backpack was missing, and our tent zipper had been torn. We found strange symbols scratched into a nearby tree. Jake, now visibly tense, suggested we pack up and leave, but I convinced him to stay one more night. We were determined not to let paranoia ruin our trip. That night, we heard rustling outside of the tent. Jake grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent cautiously. He shone the flashlight into the darkness, but there was no one there. Suddenly, a low voice whispered from the shadows. Having fun? I screamed, and Jake jumped back. We scrambled out of the tent and shone the flashlight in all directions. A figure darted behind a tree, and then another. It was Greg and Laura. Is this a joke? Jake yelled, his voice shaking. Greg stepped out, his face unnervingly calm. You shouldn't have come here. Laura appeared beside him, her smile now sinister with a smirk. This forest doesn't like visitors. Jake grabbed my arm. We're leaving. We hurriedly packed our belongings, our hearts pounding as Greg and Laura stood silently, watching us from the edge of the clearing. As we drove away, we glanced back to see the couple standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the car's taillights. When we finally got home, Jake and I locked every door and window, still shaken. We reported the incident to the local authorities, who promised to investigate, but no trace of Greg or Laura were ever found. We've not been camping since. Even years later, in the safety of our own home, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear we hear faint laughter just outside of our window.